So, if this has worked properly, you're watching the Illustrative Games section of this repertoire. So, what we're going to do here is essentially look at some model games, some high-level games, some of my efforts, and we're going to see some typical things that can happen in the middle game out of the French Tarash. So, what we're going to do is we're going to go sort of chronologically through the lines. We're going to start with games in variations that I presented at the beginning, and then we're going to slowly work our way to the sidelines that I showed at the end. So, we're going to begin with basically currently the undisputed main line of the French Tarash, which is knight f6. We're going to go through the opening moves pretty quickly because we've already been over this. I've already provided explanations and stuff in the repertoire itself. cd4, cd4, f6, e takes f6, knight takes f6, castles. It doesn't really matter whether you start with knight f3 or whether you start with castles. I think I gave knight f3 first in the repertoire, but it doesn't make so much of a difference just as long as both moves get played in the two moves span. And black plays queen c7. Well, we focused a lot on castles in the repertoire, and this is because, well, okay, first of all, I think castles is the best move, and there are more forcing lines, not necessarily forcing lines, but black has more possibilities that you need to know something about in those variations. Whereas queen c7, our play is more natural. You set up with h3, bishop e3, and so on. But queen c7 is probably a move you'll meet more in practical games than castles. It's more common in the databases, and, well, club players, I think, are more likely to go queen c7 than castles. This has proven true in my own games. Because, well, club players, they want to win with black. So castles is not such a good winning attempt because it allows white to go bishop f4 and immediately simplify the position, at which point it's not terribly easy for black to play for a win. Whereas with queen c7, he's definitely saying, alright, I'm going to make a slightly awkward move, but I am definitely going to keep all four sets of minor pieces on the board for now. So anyway, queen c7. We're going to start off by looking at a game between David Navarra and Bart Michaels. Michaels, I guess that's how you say it. From 2015. This was played in the Dutch tournament Tata Steel, Group B. So we have a very strong, I don't know what the cutoff point for Super Grandmaster is these days, but I guess 27 plus. He's a Super Grandmaster with the white pieces, and a solid GM with black. So definitely not a pushover. H3, castles, bishop e3, bishop d7, and rook e1. So I do prefer going rook e1 first instead of rook c1, just because it sort of dissuades black. Well, okay, black's got this quote-unquote bad French bishop on the light squares here, but if given enough time, he's going to go bishop d8 and bishop h5, and suddenly, well, the bad bishop isn't looking so bad anymore. So rook e1 sort of helps dissuade this by introducing sort of latent pressure on the e-file, which means that if black goes bishop e8, white can come in with knight g5, and the rook being on the e-file actually helps black feel uncomfortable with regard to the state of the e6 pawn, because, if white ever plays knight f4 and then the e-file starts to clear, the e6 pawn could be in a lot of trouble. And yeah, it's awkward because it's difficult to suggest a fully satisfactory move that covers the e-pawn. So black went bishop f7 in the game, which I think is the best move. But clearly it's not ideal because now white, at the time of his choosing, has the opportunity to grab this bishop and obtain the bishop pair, which obviously is not ideal from black's perspective. But if you play a move like queen e7, then white is able to get knight f4 in. And yeah, the e6 pawn is coming under fire. And if at any point you're forced to play bishop takes f4 and bishop takes f4, this actually later ended up occurring in the game, this exchange. This is a very strategically undesirable exchange for black because remember earlier when black went queen c7, he's not even willing to exchange off this bishop for white's bishop, let alone for a knight when black's dark square bishop disappears and white gets to keep his own. So basically, white has dominion over all the dark squares on the board. So that's a highly undesirable scenario for black. So bishop f7, there's no need to take this right away. It's not running away anywhere yet. So Just make a sensible developing move, rook c1, put the rook opposite black's queen. Fair enough. And Michaels went king h8. Now, the point of this move is pretty clear. He wants to go bishop g8 and, well, make it so that his bishop's not in capture anymore. Now, a lot of players at this point would be like, okay, black's threatening to move his bishop away, therefore I should take it before it's able to run away. I have the bishop pair, I have a slight advantage. There's nothing wrong with this line of thinking. This logic's perfectly sound. But Navarra decided, you know what, if he's going to play moves like king h8 and bishop g8, I'm not going to stop him from doing that. I'm just going to keep on doing what I'm doing. So he goes a3, bishop g8, b4, just continuing with his business. And while black is spending tempi to avoid getting his bishop exchanged off, white's making some serious progress on the queen side. b5 is a threat, so black stopped with a6. And now Navarra played a very interesting move, g3. Just preparing for this knight to come to e4, where it puts more pressure on the e-pawn, and it also one step closer to unveiling white's rook. Now, up to this point, black's position was worse. He's definitely worse, but nothing disastrous has happened just yet. But with black's next move, he sort of takes it from, okay, slightly worse, to now, alright, your position's genuinely bad. He went h6, which, makes a lot of sense at first glance, because, well, the bishop's no longer in capture on f7, so it looks like the knight might just have to go back. Unfortunately for Michaels, this weakens the g6 square, which coincided with the fact that Navarra just prepared knight f4, means that black's got some serious problems after knight f4, because the knight's now threatening to come into g6, and this compels black to exchange off his dark square bishop. And after queen d7, knight f3, white has basically everything he can hope for out of the French Tarrasch. He's started his counterplay on the queen side. Black's bishop on g8 is kind of passive. He's got a very nice potential square on e5 for his knight. He's got a bishop which rules over all the dark squares, and he's got the bishop pair. And it's just an excellent position for white. And we'll see how quickly black's position falls apart from here. But yeah, it's very difficult. Black went bishop h7, just trying to exchange off his passive bishop for white's good bishop. Navarra wasn't having any of that. He went b5, a b5, bishop b5, with the very simple idea of plopping a knight on e5. So you can play a move like rook takes a3, but okay, after knight e5, white's definitely going to win his pawn back on c6. He's probably going to win the e-pawn at some point, and he's got a very, very good knight on e5, which sort of just dominates the board. So Michaels went for queen e7, which, okay, it loses a pawn, but it's an attempt to get counterplay and free his game. If you take on a3, white will take on e6, so you're still a pawn down, so Michaels instead chose knight e4. So, at first glance, it looks like maybe black's doing okay. Like, alright, he's sacrificed a pawn, but he's got a very strong knight on e4, and, alright, white's extra pawn sitting on a3 is vulnerable. It's not the safest extra pawn in the world. So, it's understandable black might have been thinking, alright, I've activated my knight, it's on a very good square, I've shut down white's play on the e-file, I'm probably going to win the a3 pawn at some point. I'm going to play queen f6, queen f5, I'm going to create some play on the king side, and I'm going to do okay. But unfortunately, he underestimated one key aspect of the position. And this has to do with the bishops of opposite color, for one thing. Which, okay, bishops of opposite color is in an endgame. As most players know, that increases the odds that a defender will be able to draw the game. Because, you know, you set up a blockade on the light squares, for example, and white's dark square bishop is rendered kind of useless in terms of breaking down this blockade. But in a middle game, opposite color bishops help the attacker, because if white starts attacking stuff on the dark squares, creates an attack on the dark squares, black's light square bishop is liable to become completely useless. So whose ever attack lands first is likely to have a very strong attack in positions with bishops of opposite color. And white's attack does end up landing first. And Navarra came up with a very strong plan here, and that was essentially to put all of his major pieces on the 7th rank, which sounds a little long-winded and unlikely at the moment. But it does end up happening sooner than you'd imagine. Um, so basically, he wants to put his rook on c7. He's going to swing this rook up and over and put it on b7 and attack horizontally along the 7th rank, which is very dangerous if he manages to achieve it. And he does manage to achieve it. So he starts with rook e3. The rook's planning to swing over to b3. Black went rook e7. Rook a7, sorry. Which, alright, it isn't the best move, but it makes sense. He's stopping the rook from coming over to c7. He's putting up some fight against the plan White has telegraphed of doubling on the 7th rank. You can probably try rook takes a3. I guess White will reply rook takes a3, queen takes a3, and win his pawn like this. Win his pawn back like this, and remain a pawn to the good. And this is clearly better for White. Rook a7, it's putting up resistance against White's plan, but at the same time it's a little passive. So White went rook b3, and Black went queen f6. So he's trying to create counterplay. He's going to bring his queen to f5 and annoy the h3 pawn, starting to create some threats. Navarra came up with a very nice move, queen c1. And what he's doing is he's just planning to come in on the 8th rank. And, alright, you definitely can't let both of White's rooks hit the 8th rank. So Black continued queen f5 and White went rook c8. So White's attacking on the 8th rank. Black drops his rook back to cover this, and White returns to the 7th rank. So very nice idea from Navarra here to use an attack on the 8th rank sort of as a decoy to get Black to abandon the 7th. And now White takes over the 7th rank. Black when queen takes h3, which isn't good, but I mean, there isn't so much to do at this point. Rook b7, and g7 is sort of caving in. There's not a ton to be done about it, especially when you consider the fact that if Black plays a move like rook g8, stuff like bishop e5 is in the air, stuff like knight e5 and knight f7 is in the air. It's already too late to properly defend this position. So Black went knight g5, knight takes g5, h takes g5, and rook takes g7. Now, obviously Navarra had calculated this. White is in a position to give up the bishop on f4. And when you think about it, it's not really so surprising, considering White is about to triple on the 7th rank. And this is kind of devastating. So Black took on f4, and White went queen c7. So yeah, it's a picturesque position. White is tripled on the 7th rank. It's not every day you see that. And Black's completely helpless because White is, first of all, threatening rook takes h7. And once the bishop moves, threatening two different mates in one, but it's too late because White does have the mating sequence, which Navarra had no doubt seen many, many moves ago. Rook g8 check, takes g8, queen e5 check, rook g7, and queen g7 mate. So a very nice attacking game, a very nice positional and attacking game from Navarra. So if we go back, Black's troubles, I think, started with bishop e8. We can even trace it back this far. Okay, nothing too horrible was happening until the move h6, which really was just a serious mistake. It weakened the g6 square, which White never managed to occupy, but it did force Black to give up his dark square bishop for a knight, which was very undesirable. And by this point, White already had a beautiful position, which he converted in very nice style. So, that was David Navarra. Now we're going to take a quick step down, and we're going to look at one of my games played in a recent tournament, which featured the same line, actually, for 16 moves. We reached this position, and Black, you can see in the notes here, this is where Michaels went king h8. My opponent instead deviated with the move h6. And okay, knight takes f7, queen takes f7. So you can see how White didn't want to play knight takes f7 until Black sort of forced him to. So after h6, not only has White sort of made Black waste a move on h6, but you could argue that it's actually a less than useless move, because it leaves the light squares around the king a little weak. So that's a positive for White. And here I went a3. So fair enough, planning b4. This is the standard plan. Now Black went e5, which, okay, it's not a good move. But to be fair, the current trend is not looking favorable for black. White's got the bishop pair, a small plus. He's ready to go in with b4, and black hasn't managed to land very much counterplay yet. If he does nothing, he's just going to be slightly worse for a while. Um, so he tries to create counterplay. This counterplay does come at a serious risk, though, because after de5, knight e5, bishop e1, there's an extra defect to black's position. He now has an isolated queen's pawn, which, okay, in later games we'll discuss more about sort of the finer points of playing with and against an isolated queen's pawn. Finer points, I mean, whatever. But yeah, black is taking a risk to sort of disrupt the general trend of white having a comfortably better position, and he's going to start trying to attack. So black went rook a d8, and at this point, I noticed there was a pawn hanging on a7, and I decided to take it, which, if you ask the computer, is a good move. Unfortunately for me, my decision to take on a7, the lines I'd calculated were almost all incorrect, as it turns out. So I kind of lucked into a correct decision there in some sense. I'd seen some stuff, but I'd completely missed other stuff. But yeah, a sensible person probably would have played a more normal move to keep a safer plus. Knight d4 I wasn't too convinced by because I thought black would be able to reply with knight c4. And the problem now is that the bishop's attacked. Well, attacked. I don't really want black to be able to take this bishop, and also attacking the b2 pawn. So what I'd really like to do, I'd want to play bishop d4 and reply to knight c4, but the square is currently occupied, so I don't think knight d4 is the best move. I'm not totally sure what the best move is here, actually. I mean, best move aside from if we're not going to take on a7 rather. Maybe bishop d4. But I really would like my knight on that square, but again, I really do want my b2 pawn covered in case of knight c4. But anyway, I took on a7, which is a very risky decision, but ultimately it turns out to be a good one. Now, knight e4, and here I went rook f1, which is okay, but in fact the better move is to play f4, which looks a little risky, because white's king is starting to get kind of airy. This bishop, though, it does a nice job of covering this diagonal, so there's never any devastating bishop c5 check or anything, because the sneaky bishop is covering all the squares. And the sack on f3, which we see in the game, it doesn't work here, because this bishop's diagonal is blunted, so there's never any threats to give mate on h2, so the sack doesn't work. And after knight g6, g3, white's king, again, it's airy. We've made a bunch of pawn moves around our king, but we've shut down black's play along the f-file for the most part. We've shut down black's play on this diagonal for the most part, and white's a pawn up. So I think that would have been the better choice for white. Instead, I went rook f1, which is kind of passive, but I said, okay, I'm a pawn up. But black does have this knight sacrifice on f3. And white has to take it. And now black has a whole bunch of moves we can try. I analyzed 5 of them, as well as the 6th move, which was played in the game. We're not going to go over anywhere near all of this. Just in case you're interested, I'll show some of it quickly. Queen takes f3 is the most obvious move, but this doesn't work because of queen d5, and then we fork off the knight. We're 2 pieces up, 2 pieces and a pawn up, and one of black's key attackers is now off the board, as well as the fact that queen h7 is in the air if black opts not to trade queens. And if you play a move like, for example, queen f5, and you take on h3, this threatens a pretty big mate on h2. And if you move the rook, then, okay, check, and then queen f2 mate. This doesn't work because of queen d5 and e5, shutting down this bishop's diagonal and ending the attack. I also looked at knight g5, which it turns out is refuted by f4, followed by a very nice defensive rook lift, like this. Okay, but queen g6 check is the best move. This is what my opponent played, and I went king h1, which is an okay move, but actually better was to play knight g3, which is a very nice move. Um, so the point is that, alright, knight takes g3 would be devastating, but it hangs the queen. And then after bishop g3, white takes on e4. And after bishop f2, bishop h7, e d5, white's a pawn up at the end of this line. His king is airy, but the position's simplified a lot. And I think white should be better with his extra pawn here. Anyways, I went king h1, and my opponent with rook takes f3, which is a mistake. Because, as natural as it looks, white gets to go knight g1, and this super knight on g1 just holds the position together. It covers the threat on h3, forces the rook back, and it just wins for white. Okay, the computer says I should take on d5 first and then go knight d1, but whatever. I was content with just being a piece up. And then after rook f5, bishop e3. Again, the knight holds everything together. It just has a safe advantage with a piece up. But black can actually hold the game if he plays the move queen h5, which is important. Different from queen h5 immediately, which we saw was refuted by f take d, queen takes h3, queen d5 check, and then e5. Throwing in the check on g6 first, and only then going to h5, this now means that queen takes h3, or queen takes f3, although mostly queen takes h3. This is now check. So the same defense doesn't work. Mostly because, hang on. Yeah, this is check. So after f takes e, yeah, queen h3, and it's gonna be mate. I got confused there for a second. Sorry. And yeah, this leads to a perpetual check, according to the computer, or a draw by repetition at any rate. In fact, I thought I was winning when I went into this line with the piece sacrifice. Then, while my opponent was thinking on this turn, I noticed queen h5, and then I thought, oh no, I'm losing, because what I saw was after knight g1, black plays queen e5, and I thought I was just mated. But what I discovered after the game, to my sort of immense comfort, was I could just play f4, and after queen f4, play knight f3, sacrificing the piece back to sort of hold everything together. And if black takes this piece, we end up in an ending where I guess white's a bit better because he's got the bishop pair, but the computer finds the resource queen f5, attacking h3. And no matter how we defend this, black draws by perpetual. If king g2, black goes back, attacks it again, and we repeat. If white goes knight g1, black goes to f4, threatening mate. We have to go back to f3, and we repeat. So it turns out queen h5 was the saving move for black. Yeah, my opponent missed this. He went for rook f3, and then I managed to hold my position together. So that was a bit of a scary experience, but it turned out all right in the end. And that's an interesting example of the sort of chaos that can potentially occur in these sorts of lines if black just goes for activity at all costs. And yeah, going back, bishop h7 was, practically speaking, a questionable decision, but objectively speaking, a good move. And, more standard play against the IQP, exploiting the bishop pair. Because, this bishop's nice. It can come to a2. It can hit the pawn. It can hit the stuff here. White's knight can come to d4 someday. It's a very nice positional position, but I got sort of greedy and I wanted to punish black immediately. So that was an interesting experience on the white side of this line. I had another one later in this tournament. In the same tournament, I got 2 chances to try out this line with h3. So that game, it went the same for a while. I played rook e1, like I did in the game we just saw, and like Navarra did. And black went rook a e8 in this game. I don't have a PGN of it up, so I'm just going to enter the moves manually. I went rook c1. Makes enough sense. Puts the rook opposite the queen, and so on. And black stepped off the b file. So this is sensible enough. And I went knight c3. And black played rook e7. which is a bit of a peculiar move, but essentially black is going for the familiar idea of bishop e8, bishop e5, but he wants to have his e6 pawn secured, because we saw before bishop e8 was met by knight g5, and the e6 pawn came under pressure. So black has the e6 pawn very secure, although it's taking him some time to make all these moves, and white is closer to getting his ideal setup in. Now here it's possible to play knight b5. I thought black might play bishop b4 here. So I decided that's okay for white. Like, okay, knight b5, bishop b4. You can go bishop d2. Nothing wrong with playing this way. But I thought may as well start with a3. This is a useful move, preparing b4. And now on knight b5, black can no longer answer. Whoops. Can no longer answer bishop b4. Now I thought black would play a6 here just to rule out the possibility of knight b5. He didn't, though. He played bishop e8. He was not afraid of knight b5, so I went knight b5. And again, black can't allow the exchange of dark square bishop for knight. We've seen what happens in the Navarra game, so he went bishop f4. And now, if bishop f4, queen f4, this would be kind of irritating for white, because the queen would be in there and doing stuff. So I'm willing to exchange dark square bishops. We've gone over this. That's a strategically desirable exchange for white. But I do want to do it on my terms. So I played queen d2. And yeah, now black has to do something. So if bishop e3, then white brings his queen into e3. And that's a nice position for white. He can plop his knight on e5 next. And that's a very, very nice position for white. So black's got to try something else. I think the best move is probably knight h5. And this is good because after the exchange of bishops happen, the knight will come into f4, and that's a pretty good active square for the knight. Now, in the game, I was considering knight g5, but I concluded it didn't work. My point with knight g5, so I'm attacking h7, right? And bishop d5 is clearly not in black's best interest. So h6, I was going to go knight h7, rook f7, and bishop g6. But the problem is, this never works because the knight on h7, after any tactical sequence, the knight on h7 is always trapped. Now, you can't play knight f6 clearly because the bishop hangs on f4. But what you can do, you can play bishop h2 check, king h1, and then rook takes f2. And bishop takes f2. Black plays bishop takes g6. So he's already got a bishop and a pawn for the rook, and this knight on h7 is doomed. So black is actually close to winning because he's picking up 2 pieces and a pawn for the thing. I hadn't actually seen this yet. I was still looking at this knight h7, bishop g6 plan when my opponent played a move other than knight h5. So I'm still not totally sure because knight g5 doesn't work. I don't know what I would play on knight h5. But I think black's doing more or less okay here. So I think white should maybe try to improve earlier. For example, you could just continue with b4 here. And then maybe after bishop h5, just come back with bishop e2 and break the pin, for example. I'm not totally sure. I haven't checked this in detail. But black's position, to my eye, looks okay-ish after knight h5. He didn't play knight h5, though. He played knight e4, which struck me as a bit of a strange choice. Because, well, after bishop e4, d e4, black's structure is not the greatest. So I went knight g5, takes on e3, queen takes e3. And now the e-pawn's in a lot of trouble, and I think white's already seriously better by this point. So he went knight a5, trying to cause a disturbance by attacking this knight. And initially I was considering just, retreating it to c3 or whatever. But okay, then I noticed that, well, queen takes e4 threatens mate on h7. It's not that simple, though. First of all, if bishop g6 is played, then the knight's no longer attacked, so that's not an issue. What could be an issue, though, is the move rook f5, which blocks the mate, and it attacks both knights. However, I think white actually has, 3 good options at least here. One of them, the first one that occurred to me was rook to c5, with the point being that Well, okay, if bishop takes b5, then rook takes f5, and the e-pawn is pinned to the rook. And if you take it, takes, and if you try to take this, then h7 is hanging again, and this is mate. So that's one way to do it, and I think white retains his pawn advantage there. Although black might be able to play something like bishop c6 to confuse the issue. I'm not totally sure. Although maybe we have... Do we have d5 in reply? Maybe, I'm not totally sure. Another way to play is queen h4. Again, using this threat on h7. So black takes on b5, white plays queen h7, queen h8 mate. And now, if black plays h6, it looks like both knights are hanging again, but white has the reply knight e4, or knight e6 actually maybe. But anyway, the point is that the rook is now hit on e7. And if black plays g5, I assume, I didn't really look at this much, but I assume that you can't really get away with this. But anyway, those are two good moves, which retain the pawn advantage at least. But eventually, after weighing my options between rook c5 and queen h4 for like 15 minutes, it finally dawned on me, oh wait, I can take on f5. So I started looking at this, because I'd sort of ruled this out, because it looks like, alright, we get two rooks for the queen, but then black takes on b5, and then we're down material. But actually, weirdly, the theme of the two rooks on the 7th rank comes back in this game. White goes rook c7, and black, I think, just loses. It looks like he's just getting mated, because his pieces are certainly in no position to defend against all the threats. And, okay, I won't go into detail on everything, but for example, if you play queen to f8, white has the reply knight e6, and black is busted, because, yeah, after, say, queen f6, you just go rook c8, and that's going to be mate, and, yeah, otherwise, rook takes g7, and so on, and there's really no defense to this plan. So after some thought, after queen f5, ef5, queen f5, ef5, rook e7, my opponent decided to go for knight back to c6, rook e6, and a6. And now it looks like, well, white might be in a bit of trouble because his pieces are starting to get kicked back. But actually, white's initiative continues. So rook e1, threatening rook takes e8. Black plays bishop d7. Looks like now white might be in trouble. Two of his pieces are attacked. But the initiative keeps going. Knight d6. And the point is that after bishop e6, rook e6, black can't do anything about rook e8. And so he has to play, for example, h6, rook e8, queen e8, knight e8, h takes g5, and then white ends up in a pawn ending, or in a knight ending with an extra pawn. This sort of thing happened in the game, except it came about via different move order. He went h6, because, yeah, again, bishop e6, rook e6, there is no defense to rook e8, which will win the material back with interest. Yeah, so we went h6 instead. And this transposes to the same sort of thing. Rook e8 check, takes, 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 takes. And we end up in a pawn ending where, a knight ending. We end up in a knight ending where white has a pawn to the good. I went d5, and 20 moves later, I ended up winning the game. We're not going to look at this in detail, but essentially, I used this pawn as sort of a distraction to tie down black's knight. I brought the king into the game. Eventually, the kingside pawn started falling. I created another pass pawn on the kingside, and eventually broke through. So what happened in this game? Black made some concessions out of the opening. Because, yeah, the opening is what we're focusing on. I think this was a very pleasant position for white. Black was forced to lose some time with moves like queen to b8 and rook to e7, and was always just a little bit slow. And at this point, maybe it was worth it to go for a knight b5 here, without spending a move on a3. Because, yeah, come to think of it, white's move a3 and black's move bishop e8. Oh, this really favors black because bishop h5 starts becoming a real concern, and that's an annoying pin. So I think I would try to improve were I faced with this position again with knight b5, because I don't think bishop b4 is a problem because of, well, for example, bishop d2. Even rook e2 might be okay, but alright, bishop d2. And if bishop f4, queen d2, we get the same sort of thing, except black's bishop isn't already poised to come out to some square. And so black can still try knight h5. But then, actually come to think of it, hang on. So knight h5, maybe now knight g5 works. Here. Maybe not, who knows. But anyways, knight h5, this is sort of a typical idea for black in this line. He wants to get his knight to f4. This is not the most common, because yeah, these bishops standing off on these particular squares isn't a usual occurrence. But this is a standard plan, knight h5 to knight f4. But yeah, knight e4 was just a bit too much of a concession, and pawns started falling, and black's game sort of fell apart from there. So, I think, since I don't want to make this too long, I think that'll probably wrap up the coverage of knight f6. Obviously, black has many other lines than this specific one with queen c7, but this is the one that you should meet most often. And this is the line that I've faced most often in my games, including twice recently. Is there anything else I want to discuss in the knight f6 line? I don't think so. So let's move on to c5. And specifically, I want to discuss the structure that occurs after e takes d5 and e takes d5. And I want to discuss the isolated pawn structure. Because it really isn't about theory, it really is about understanding the positions. And we're going to look at two model games from the white side. Just let me pause the recording and fetch the PGN. Alright, here we go. So we've got a game here between Michael Adams and Arthur Yusupov, which was played back in 2005. Michael Adams, by the way, if ever you're looking for material to study for the white side of the French Tarrasch, you can't go wrong with Michael Adams. He has a huge score on the white side of the French, and he pretty much exclusively plays the Tarrasch variation. And he's a very strong positional player, and very good player to watch and look for the ideas that he uses and try to apply them in your own games. Anyway, so we had this line with c5, and we quickly got an isolated pawn structure. This is one of the main lines of the c5 variation. Okay, and yeah, we did look at this, and we did establish in that chapter that after bishop b6, the best way to play for white is to go rook e1 and bishop e3 to neutralize this bishop, which is why Yusupov decided to go to d6 instead. Yeah, that way this bishop's not so easily neutralized, but it does kind of abandon the d4 square-ish. So white went rook e1, castles bishop d3. We've discussed this. This is white's playing against the light square bishop, because yeah, coming out to f5 would just exchange pieces, and currently coming out to g4 is not something you can do because of bishop takes h7. So let's see this. Bishop takes h7, king h7, knight g5, and queen takes g4. So Yusupov, he's now threatening bishop g4 because he's avoided bishop takes h7, and he's also stopping white's bishop from coming out to g5. And white goes h3, stopping the bishop from coming out to g4. And black goes knight f5, c3. So this move is a multi-purpose one. It stops, well, okay, it takes further control over the d4 square. It stops black from thinking about playing d4 himself and advancing his IQP. It also prepares the idea of bishop c2 and queen d3, which is a very important idea in this line. So black goes queen f6, and white plays bishop c2. So black is playing very actively. He's got his fair share of control over the d4 square. So white has to do something to kind of mess him up. And the same idea would apply if black played bishop c7 here. This is the other main move. Essentially intending kind of a similar plan. Bishop c7 followed by queen d6. And still then bishop c2 would be a good move. So remember this idea. Bishop c2, black went rook d8. Notice that bishop c2 actually serves a dual purpose. It, as well as preparing queen d3, it attacks the d5 pawn. So black has to take a move out to deal with that. Now, of course, queen takes d5 would run into bishop h2 check. And then white goes queen d3. So, clearly he's threatening to play g4, which would be rather inconvenient for black because his knight would then be pinned to, if it moves, queen h7 check, king f8, queen h8 mate. So black has to play a slight weakening move in g6 to blunt this diagonal. And this is a very nice positional play from Adams here. So he plays bishop c2 and queen d3 to induce g6. That weakens the h6 pawn, so he slides back to d2 to attack the newly created weakness on h6. Now he's threatening bishop takes f5, followed by queen takes h6, unless black plays g takes f, when h6 will be defended, but his position will be a mess. So black plays bishop f8, and Adams comes into f4. So white induced g6, weakening h6. He attacked h6. By attacking h6, he induced bishop f8, which weakened f4, and he came into f4. Now g4 is again a threat. Black went bishop g7 to cover his queen. And now Adams went bishop d2. Now to quote Colin Crouch, who has since sadly passed on, in his book, Modern Chess Move by Move, he says Adams plays a star move and an improvement on previous play. At first, this is only a routine developing move and anyone could play it. Look more closely, however, and the bishop is covering the queen's best escape square. And horrors, the queen may even get stuck on the nightmare square of h1. Most strong players who've reached this would presumably have rejected the text move just on this basis. Adams has seen further and seen that the queen will return. So, what's he talking about? After g5, because we stuck our bishop on d2, the queen no longer has the d2 square to retreat to. You could go to a4, but that's sort of an irrelevant square for the queen. And plus, black would be able to play bishop d7. And yeah, the queen still doesn't manage to get to safety. So, white's queen looks dumb on h2, but it still influences the center in bizarre hypermodern style. It still influences the center, and in order to make the queen go to h2, black had to further weaken his king side. So we had to play g5, which is a bit of a concession to make this happen. Now, use of pawn b6. Just preparing to get his bishop out. The most interesting move would have been bishop f8, at which point white can play rook ad1, and after bishop d6, the queen is forced to go into the corner, which, I mean, this looks horrendous for white, but the point is that white at some point will be able to play g4. The queen, bizarrely, will still be able to participate in the action from h1, and very oddly put pressure on the d5 pawn. So this is presumably what Adams had seen. Sadly, we didn't get to see that on the board, which would have been fun to see. But anyway, black went b6. And after rook ad1, we return to sort of more traditional isolated queen's pawn strategies. Bishop a6, and now white took on f5. So white's fighting for the all-important square in front of the IQP by exchanging his one piece on the board that can never fight for control of it for black's piece that was currently influencing it. And this is a good time to do it. Because the bishop left c8, black no longer has a convenient reply of bishop takes f5. Like, for instance, if you do it in a position like this is not a good time to exchange on f5, because this bishop would become very active. It comes into e4, and suddenly it's starting to annoy everyone. But now that the bishop has left for a6, black's sort of forced to capture with the queen, which is less desirable. So now Lev Sakis writes about this position. White's got a better pawn structure and well-placed pieces, which prevent any possible counterplay from black. So yeah, he's got black's got the isolated pawn. Black's weakened his king a little bit. White still is very, very solid. He's had to give up the bishop pair, but again, better pawn structure, well-placed pieces. He's going to occupy d4 next turn. Black went bishop c4. White went knight bd4. And Yusupov played bishop takes d4. Now, definitely this is a concession, especially having played these moves to give up the bishop that's defending your king. But it's not so easy to suggest an alternative. Because you do want to somehow challenge this blockade of the d-pawn. And you don't want to have to, like, passively move your queen away. Because, like, okay, if you play queen d7, for example, that's kind of passive, and I guess White will probably just play... Well, okay, he'll play knight d6, queen c6, bishop d4, and try to exchange off this defensive bishop anyways. Or maybe play knight e5. Knight e5 looks like a decent move. Anyway, yeah, Yusupov went bishop d4. Sakis, in his notes, he suggests knight takes d4. Bishop... Sorry, I don't want to promote that line. He suggests knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, and he really wants to keep this bishop. He suggests f6. Although, clearly, this isn't especially pleasant either. The bishop lives to defend the king, but it's a little bit buried. And White has a good position. He can play maybe rook e7, infiltrate like this. The queen, from its lookout, its observatory on h6, can come into c7. We actually do see this in the game in a second. But anyway, Yusupov went bishop d4, knight d4, knight d4, bishop d4. And now we have, we're back to the opposite color bishops situation. The French Tarrasch is not especially aggressive, but we've seen now, we saw it in the Navarra game, and now we're seeing it in the Adams game. Bishops of opposite color. And like we said, that favors the side is attacking, and it's pretty clear to see which side is going to be doing the attacking. Black's king is weak, White's bishop is perfectly placed, and White's pieces are all poised to infiltrate. Meanwhile, this poor bishop sitting on c4 is really not participating in the action at the moment. So anyway, Yusupov went rook e8, and Adams went in with queen c7. Yeah. Yusupov grabbed on a2. Sakis writes, Arthur Yusupov doesn't feel the danger. Bishop cannot contribute to the defense from the so remote location. This is true, although it's a little difficult to defend it anyways. So Yusupov, I guess, decided, alright, well, I'm going to face a pretty strong attack, so I may as well defend, or I might as well grab a pawn, just in case I survive. But Adams was not too keen on letting him survive. He played queen c6, which is an excellent move, because now Black kind of has a problem on h6. And yeah, I don't see what to do to defend it, because don't forget the rook on e8 is also attacked. And you can exchange on e1, but this probably won't help, because now the rook on a8 is hanging in addition to h6. Yusupov tried rook f8. Whoops. Tried rook f8. And after queen h6, he tried to block out the d4 bishop with f6. But that left the 7th rank weak. White jumped in with rook e7, rook f7, and rook de1. Black tried to hold his ground with rook f8, but it wasn't happening. So, of course, rook takes f7 runs into rook e8 with checkmate. And now White plays g4. So, what Crouch writes is, we've seen this pawn move before, though previously White's queen may have started off from the extremely unlikely square of h1 or h2. That's true, we did see earlier the queen was on h1, White went d4, and the queen was influencing play along this diagonal. Here the queen's out in the open, and quickly wins. Black's queen has no good square, in view of White's pressure on f6 and h7. He's definitely correct. The queen can't keep both of these key squares under control at the same time. If you go, say, to d3, keeping h7 under control, queen takes f6 is going to be mate. If you go to... well, okay, there's no square where you keep f6 defended. And if you play queen g6, White wins with rook e7 check, which forces the king away from the queen. Queen takes g6, and white's up a boatload of material. So after g4, Arthur Yusupov did resign. So a very nice game from Adams. Um, so this he showed some important ideas. First of all, even from the opening, this preventing black from getting his pieces out conveniently with bishop d3 and h3. c3 was an excellent multi-purpose move. It shows the importance of the d4 square, as well as this very nice plan trying to create a further weakness. Principle of two weaknesses states your opponent having one weakness is not enough to win. In this case, so far, in a position like this, black's only got one weakness, the isolated pawn. So you attack the isolated pawn, black defends it, and then you don't really make much progress. So white starts looking for a second weakness. He creates some weaknesses over on the king side, and then he turns his attention back to the d4 square. His pieces coordinate very nicely, and using the weaknesses he induced earlier on the king side, he comes through for the kill. Okay, so we're going to take a quick look at another game. So I mentioned a book called Playing the French a decent amount in my in the 3c5 chapter. And yeah, I did have a look at this book because it does recommend c5 for black, and it's a very good repertoire book. If you are interested in playing the French with black, it's a good book to pick up. And this game specifically is what made the author, is what sort of dissuaded the author from recommending this system with ed5 and ed5, is what he writes in the book. So it was in the line with knight f6. Last game we saw knight c6. So white got to exchange off a set of pieces, and then we reached the standard IQP position, where white went knight c3, knight ce4, knight d4. So again, we saw this in the theory section. So what white is doing is he's making black play the less than convenient move queen d7 by threatening to play knight f5 and grab the bishop. So black goes queen d7, f3, knight goes back to d6, and now that the queen's on d7, we get knight c5 with tempo, queen c8, and the knight drops back to d3 with a very nice arrangement of the knights. Black castled, bishop e3, rook e8, bishop drops back to f2. White has very nice control over the position. This knight is sort of being controlled by this pawn. This knight has the option to go to c4, but it's not clear what it's doing there because this knight is very nicely defending this. The pawn is blockaded. White has good control over the square in front of the IQP. This bishop's safely tucked away on f2. So black went bishop d8. White went a4. I think I ended up suggesting rook e1 instead. But, alright, a4 is a decent move as well. And after knight f5, takes was played, and rook e1. So the position's beginning to simplify. The d4 square is still under white's control. Black doesn't have any pieces controlling it at the moment, and white's bishop on f2 is still influencing that square. Black's bishop emerged on c7. White traded a set of rooks, and he grabbed on a7. So here's where a4 starts to become a little useful. Like it controlled the b5 square, that was one point, but now after b6, white is able to rescue his bishop with a5, so it doesn't just get trapped. And after b takes a5, queen to d2, white has managed to inflict damage on black's pawn structure. So again, principle of two weaknesses. If we go back to a position like this, black has one weakness, but it's not enough to win the game if your opponent just has one weakness. So by splitting black's pawns on the queen side, white has managed to create a second front. Now black has two isolated pawns. So white continued with h3. Black went queen h5, to which white replied h3. The dark squares look a bit shaky on the king side, but actually it's nothing to worry about, because remember this bishop on a7, it's dropping back to its previous home on f2, and sort of holding everything together. And bishop g3 can be safely met by, for instance, takes, and queen f4. when, yeah, black's being given the option of entering and ending. That's very undesirable for him. Or white can just grab on a5 if he feels like it. So black went queen over to c4, b3, queen to c6, and white went bishop d4, occupying the square in front of the IQP. Standard stuff. And it's important, this bishop can't really be challenged, because if black tries to exchange it with his own bishop, then the a5 pawn is going to end up being fatally weak. So black's bishop is a little bit tied down to this pawn. Black's defenses are starting to get a bit spread out. h6, king f1, preparing perhaps, I guess, rook e1, preparing for the ending, getting the king a little bit closer. Black tries to take advantage of this by popping his knight into g3 with check, and white calmly slides the bishop back to f2. d6, rook e1. The rooks come off the board, and we've reached a more simplified position. Black still has these two weaknesses. And black plays g5. I'm not sure about the decision to play g5. It looks like black is just exposing his king for no particular reason. I guess he didn't want to go down passively, but this sort of creates a third front white has the potential to attack on. And white went g4. Yeah, now for example, if this knight leaves the board, like after knight f4, takes. Yeah, again, we have this kind of situation. White will bring his bishop back to d4, and again, there's going to be threats on the a pawn, there's going to be potential threats on the back rank. It's going to be very difficult for black to defend. Instead, he dropped his knight back to g7, and white popped his knight into c5. And yeah, this is a strong knight. White is ready to do stuff like come in with queen e7, perhaps, come in with queen a6 to try to trade more stuff off. So black went knight e6, knight e6, fe6. So this pawn is no longer isolated, but this pawn group, the pawn on e6 is still kind of shaky. And, okay, if black was able to push e5, maybe he could get like a pawn roller going. But white, of course, stops it in his tracks. Queen e8, queen a6 coming in, e5. So white's got something, but a5 is falling, and the king is weak, h6 is weak. Black's just not able to hold it together. He attacks f3, white defends f3 very calmly. White picks up a pawn, and black played e4, which is a bad move, although his situation was pretty grim in any case, and he resigned after queen c8. Because your choices are, you step onto the 7th rank, queen takes c7, there's no time for, well, there's no queen takes f3 because the queen's pinned, or you block and then white takes, and takes. So we flipped through that game pretty quickly, but just because this video is already getting pretty long already, but that's a nice demonstration of how to play against the IQP. And the authors of Play the French, they wrote that it sort of concerned them how effortlessly white was able to just squeeze black without doing anything special, really. All of these moves are very natural. And, yeah, black ends up experiencing problems. White manages to get the second weakness going, and he just plays calm moves, slowly improves his position, slowly but surely getting more and more pieces off the board and getting closer and closer to black's demise, and inducing black to create more and more weaknesses. And finally, he's able to win the game. All right, so we're now going to move on to the line we covered in the third chapter, which is d takes e4. All right, anyway, so in this game, knight c3 was played. The Rubinstein variation can equally be reached starting with knight c3 or with knight d2. So the move order we'd use, knight d2, d takes e4, knight takes e4. So this line is solid for black, but it's kind of passive. But it's also a bit of a practical choice because you can play it against both knight c3 and knight d2. On the other hand, it's not so easy to win, so if you're playing to win, it's also a less practical choice. So we're going to look at this game by Alexei Shirov, and also a couple of my games, because I've faced d takes e4 twice, as far as I can remember anyways, and they were both against fairly lower rated opponents. So we will take a quick look at those. So anyway, knight d2, d takes e4, knight takes e4 transposes to this. And in this game between Shirov and Chernin, played in the PCA qualifiers in 1993, Chernin went for the so-called Fort Knox variation, intending to swing the bishop around to c6. And Shirov went knight f3, bishop c6. Shirov says, I've got some quotes from Shirov from his book Fire on Board. So he writes that he's always happy to play against this system with white because black loses some time compared with the Caro-Kann. Sure, it's a Caro-Kann sort of structure, but black is making sort of a strange-ish bishop maneuver rather than having it out on f5 or something. Bishop d3, knight d7. So the first game I played against d takes e4, my opponent played knight f6, which falls for sort of a famous trap. After knight takes f6, black has to play d takes f6, even though that's clearly not desirable. If queen takes f6, white wins as follows. Bishop g5, which traps the queen. Bishop takes f3, and now queen d2. And black's queen is dead because after queen d4, there's bishop b5 check. Oops. There's bishop b5 check. And yeah, I won that game in I think 20 moves or something. But yeah, that's if you don't know this trap, it can sneak up on you. Anyways, best move is knight d7, preparing knight f6. So after knight takes f6, black can recapture with the knight. This is what Chernin played. Castles knight f6. Knight g3. Bishop e7. b3. Castles, bishop b2, and bishop f3. So Shirov said that he thought this move was dubious, and he says it's not necessary yet. This book came out in, I think, 1999. Since then, its theory sort of crystallized towards, well, okay, black really doesn't have a better move than bishop takes f3. So black gives up the bishop pair, but he's sort of solidified his structure. He's got the proper c6, e6 Caro-Kann structure. He's got that going. And clearly white's got a small advantage. I don't think you can really dispute that. But black's got no weaknesses at the moment. And if white overextends, he might even have chances to win. So anyway, white grabs some space, c4. Black, he doesn't have much room to move. He's trying to reposition his bishop. Rook e1, bishop f8. Rook d1, queen a5. So it makes a lot of sense to get the queen off of this rook's diagonal. Queen to a5. Shirov, in his notes, points out that the immediate g6 would run into the move d5. And yeah, black's got some problems now involving this diagonal plus the d file. It's all sort of coming apart for black in this case. So queen a5 makes a lot of sense. Bishop b1, defending the a pawn and just sort of getting the bishop out of the way of this rook. And black plays g6. So black's trying to reposition his dark square bishop to perhaps a better home on g7. But this does cause some weaknesses on the dark squares, which Shirov very skillfully went on to exploit. He started with h4, planning on h5 to sort of soften up black's kingside. Black played bishop to g7. White went bishop c3. So white does want to go h5, but currently black's got 1, 2, 3 pieces on it. So he first kicks the queen away from the defense of the h5 square, then goes in for h5. Black tried to create some counterplay with b5, and Shirov went in for h6. This turns out to be a good move, although Shirov, in his book, he thought that this was the right idea, but in the wrong move order. And he thinks that white should start with bishop d2 and only then play h6. Anyways, h6. The point is that, alright, after bishop h8, this pawn is very annoying. And, yeah, there's still problems on the dark squares. And the bishop not being able to be on g7 creates some issues. And there's always, black has to worry about some mates with the pawn on h6 supporting. So Chernin decided to get rid of that pawn with bishop takes h6. Shirov had thought this was impossible because of the retort d5, when this pawn is crashing through and black's knight is hanging. But black actually gets to sacrifice the knight. C takes d5, bishop takes f6, and now b takes c4 was played. So black's getting 3 pawns for the piece, but this is incorrect. What black should play is he should start with knight takes f6. Whoops, didn't want to promote that. Would be, sorry, whoops. Knight takes f6, queen takes f6, bishop g7, and only then b takes c4. Black would have 3 pawns, and black would be the one that possesses a powerful dark square bishop. The problem with bishop c4, with b takes c4 right away, is it lets this bishop live, and then this ends up being a part of the final attack. So black is even on material, but he's in a lot of trouble. These bishops pointing towards, can't highlight them for some reason, pointing towards black's king are very ominous. C takes b3 is not the best move. Shirov recommends playing bishop g7 instead, just to stop any and all action along the diagonal. But this allows for a beautiful conclusion to the game. Shirov said the rest of this game gave him some aesthetic pleasure. Knight h5. Very good move. If takes on h5, then, okay, you really can't survive this attack after, for example, queen takes h5. Whoops. Because the bishops pointing toward the king are just far too strong. So Chernin tried f5 instead. Rook takes d5. And so the king gets caught in the crossfire. If e d5, queen d5, king f8, bishop a3, you get caught in the crossfire. So Chernin tried takes here instead, and rook takes f5. So this is a very nice sort of poisoned rook sequence. The same point occurs ef5, queen d5, king f8, bishop a3. So knight f8, rook takes h5, ba2, bishop a2. So white's now only a pawn down, but as you can see, black's king is wide open, and all of white's pieces are pointed towards it. So Shirov concluded the game quickly. Still no respite for black. All of white's pieces are in the attack, and finally the game concluded here because well, okay, white's a bishop up because both of these pieces are pinned. I guess Chernin played e5 and then resigned because rook takes e5 is just winning for white. So that's a nice illustration of how to break down black's kind of solid Fort Knox setup. Now g6 created some weaknesses along the diagonal and opened up opportunities for Shirov to play a strong d5. But if he doesn't play g6, it's hard to say what black's doing with his pieces. He's really running out of room for them. This bishop on f8 is kind of passive, the rook's passive, this is passive, and so on. So g6 is an attempt to put the pieces on better squares. When white starts having these ideas, h4, h5, normally you don't want to move pawns around your king, generally speaking, but black's pieces are nowhere near in good enough position to actually exploit the slight weakening of the king. And if black doesn't go for g6, well, you've got the same ideas. Look out for an opportunity to play a convenient d5, and just enjoy chess. Because black's not really trying to do anything too ambitious. You can try to expand on the queen side, for instance. Lots of possible ideas to play for. Knight h5, if the queen is somewhere else, like you can kick it away with bishop c3, then play knight h5, exchange off a defender, and so on. White really just gets free play. I was going to show another game I had in the Rubinstein variation, but I decided not to. That game wasn't especially instructive, and this video has gone far too long already. So let's have a look at another game in a different variation. Alright, so we're now going to look at a game with the knight c6 line. Contrary to what it says on the thing, this actually wasn't played in the Netherlands. I don't know how to remove that. This was played in the Chess Olympiad 2014 in Tromsø between Sam Shankland and Gluckman. So yeah, play went like this. C3, again, kind of a waiting move, controlling the b4 square, supporting the d pawn, not wanting to move this bishop, so that if black plays b6, bishop a6, we don't have to lose a tempo before we just straight up take on a6, and so on. b6, h4. So, yeah, after h6, Shankland went rook h3. Now, if I remember correctly, the line I recommended, I wanted to go bishop e3, and then go knight fd2, and then bring the queen out somewhere. Rook h3 is also a fine move. This is one of the points of playing h4. Shankland wants to swing his rook over to g3 to put pressure on the g7 pawn. Gluckman went bishop a6, and white traded off his bishop. So black has managed to trade off his sort of bad bishop for white's pretty decent bishop. But, yeah, this rook is awkward on a6. We'll see black actually returning the rook to a8 immediately on the next turn, and white has saved a tempo with his bishop. Shankland went h5. So he's doing a few things with this move. He's clamping down on this pawn group, so the g7 pawn is a bit backward, as well as the fact that it just it calmly removes it from the bishop's line of capture, just in case. We'll see this is a very closed position, so tempi aren't all that significant, which is why, for example, black is able to get away with rook a6 and rook back to a8, and why white is able to get away with such maneuvers like rook h3, rook g3 that would, in an open position, be pretty outlandish. So anyway, he puts his rook on g3, and black has to go back with the bishop, so that's a small concession. And Shankland played king f1, which, to be honest, I don't fully understand. He's bringing his king over to sort of castle by hand. Again, it's not the most pressing matter to attend to, but the position is closed. The value of a move isn't very high. So it's fine to spend tempi on just sort of just-in-case moves. Knight b8 and bishop e3. Now, one thing to note, king f1, a bit of a waiting move. If he'd gone bishop e3 right away, knight e7 would be a pretty decent reply, because, well, now this is threatening knight f5, and if white prevents this with knight h4, then black can break with c5. After king f1, black played knight b8, just trying to rearrange his pieces. He wants to get his queen to d7, maybe try to run the king over to the queen side. Bishop e3, and now after knight e7, knight h4, c5 is no longer so good because, well, the knight's no longer on d7 to support it. So queen d7, and now Shankland makes another instructive maneuver, knight c1. The knight's not doing anything on b3 anymore. This pawn on b6 controls it nicely. By the way, when in chess, when someone refers to a pawn controlling a knight, what Steinitz said about knights is that knights are no good if they don't have any advanced support points. Meaning, if a knight's on a square and it has nowhere to go to forward, it's not a very good piece on that square. So currently this b6 pawn is stopping the knight from advancing anywhere. So that generally means it's time to reposition the knight. And in fact, the knight's actually blocking white's potential play with b4. So all the more reason to get it out of the way. Knight goes back to c1 and into d3. So the knight's not much better on d3, but it is demonstrably better. It can come to f4 if that ever becomes necessary. Again, it's not a huge improvement, but it's a closed position. Maneuvers are the thing to do, and it just clears the way for a later b2, b4. And we can see that black is, he's taking a few turns to run his king over. Rook c1, again, maybe not the most prevalent move, but he's introducing the idea of c4. He's saying maybe I'll go c4 someday. And now he brings the queen into b3, which is very interesting, because you'd think white would be trying to play on the king side. He won his queen like on g4 or something. But he's trying to create a bit of confusion on the queen side. He's introducing the idea of knight to c5 by pinning the b pawn, so it's interesting. Black hides his king over on a7, and white goes rook g4. So now what he's trying to do is, now that the rook's attacked this pawn, he's going to bring it over to f4 and start tickling the f7 pawn. Black went knight a6, and white tried to confuse matters by putting his queen on b5. Just a bit of an awkward pin on the knight. Make black go rook to d8 to resolve the pin, and then rook f4. Knight cb8 is played. Knight to d2. So white's willing to exchange queens, but only on his terms. Now if queen takes b5, a takes b5, the knight's trapped. And also f7 is falling in. So black decides to keep queens on. He goes c6, and white goes back to b3, and black plays queen e8. So, I mean, again, the position's very closed. It doesn't look like white's achieved much, but all of his pieces are better placed than black's. Again, in a closed position, these guys aren't necessarily doing much, but if the center ever does open, white's pieces are much more ready for combat than black's rather uncoordinated forces. So white's queen has done its annoyance on the queen side, so it comes back to the king side. And that was the point of putting the knight on d2, is to clear the way for the queen to come back. And after bishop e7, queen f3, putting more pressure on f7. Black went bishop e7 to clear the way for rook f8 to cover f7. But the problem now is that with the bishop not on f8, defensive g7's been abandoned. So Shanklin switches his rook back over here, and yeah, it's not so easy to conveniently defend this pawn anymore, because, well, okay, rook g8, white can go queen g3, and it can't hold, because on bishop f8, this bishop takes h6, with the g7 pawn being pinned. So black had to make a bit of a concession, weakening his pawns over here a little bit, and then queen h3, attacking them, h5, and rook f4. So yeah, these pawns are kind of vulnerable now. They're much less solid than they were previously. And also the e6 pawn. All of this by forcing black to play g5. And again, all of those moves ago, when white went h5, this is why he did it, to make the g7 pawn backwards, so that eventually if white put enough pressure on it and forced black to come forward, after hg, fg, the e pawn, the g pawn, and the h pawn would all be weakened. So white's made actually significant progress by this point. Knight c7, knight f3, just improving the pieces. And now a very strong move, rook f6. So he's just throwing the rook in there. He's preparing a potential exchange sacrifice, rook takes e6. And then maybe trying to work on queening the e-pawn. And after bishop takes f6, e takes f6, the position is still quite closed, so the rooks have less value, because they have no open lines. And importantly, while this f-pawn can be annoying, he's cleared the e5 square for a knight, and that's just a beautiful square for a knight, because it can't really be so conveniently exchanged off, especially since white has two knights that, if black trades off one of them, you replace it with the other knight. Knight d7 won't be so easy to play because the c6 pawn will hang, and this c7 knight is a long way away from exchanging itself for a knight on c5. Rook f8, bishop g5, and okay, already white is probably winning his material back by force, because, well, you can't really blockade it because the knight comes into e5. So black went knight d7, and Shanklin elected to win his material back straight away. Now he's only a pawn down, so what it's essentially become is a pawn sacrifice to clear the e5 square. And now we reach a position where both sides have a queen, a knight, and a rook, but it's clear to see that white's knight is far superior to black's knight. Black's knight, I don't know what square on the board would be good for it, that it can conveniently reach. Like, it would take several turns to get to, to here or here, and that, well, okay, black would have to figure out a way to not hang his c-pawn, like he'd have to move the queen out of the way to free e8 without blundering his c-pawn, and of course, he has to worry about the immediate attempt to mate black on the queen side, which comes in now with b4. And we won't look at the rest of the game, but this was really a model game from Shanklin. This knight is beautifully posted on e5. Again, there's the targets on the king side, and principle of two weaknesses. he's trying to make an attack on black's slightly exposed king. So ultimately, he did end up breaking through and winning the game over here. So to sum up, some key things to remember. This rook lift putting pressure on g7 is an idea. h5, even just generally, is a good idea to keep in mind in sort of similar pawn play things, just fixing these two pawns behind to make the g7 pawn backward. And furthermore, these ideas, the knight, after it's overstayed its welcome on b3, swinging around to d3, the idea of b4, the idea of putting pressure on f7 as well as g7, sort of switching back and forth which pawn white wants to attack, and so on. It's really just a nice position to play with white, because black really doesn't have any clear counterplay. All his pawn breaks. c5 is kind of weakening, f6 is pretty weakening. It's kind of difficult to point to one single moment and say, okay, that's where black messed up, because it was really, like, black didn't really achieve much throughout the game, but it was very difficult to suggest productive moves on his behalf. Alright, this is going to be the last game, I promise. Not least because I'm starting to lose my voice. So this is going to be about the bishop e7 line, which is the last line I've decided is important enough to merit its own illustrative game. So again, the line I suggest is e5, c5, c3, and bishop d3, cd4, cd4. Of course, to recap, you can't take this pawn because, okay, you lose after queen g4 because the knight and, well, the rook in the corner effectively are forked because if you move the knight, queen g7 wins the rook in the corner. So black tried knight h6 instead, temporarily putting the knight on the edge of the board, preparing to come to f5 to pressure the base of the d4, e5 pawn chain. White goes knight f3. Again, our setup in this line is pretty similar to the one we want in the main line with knight f6, in which we get our knights to e2 and then the other one to f3. So yeah, here in this version we normally start with knight d to f3, although most of the time it doesn't really matter. Queen a5 check. By the way, this game is between Ruslan Ponomarev, former FIDE world champion, and Georgi Orlov. This was played in the Pro Chess League this year. So anyway, queen a5 check, bishop d2, queen b6. So Orlov's point was he wanted to induce the bishop to d2 before playing queen to b6. Fair enough. And the bishop comes to c3 to support this pawn chain. Bishop d7 castles, rook c8. So the bishop's quite passive at the moment. But again, if white manages to keep his center intact, he's probably going to be better. King h8, king h1, sorry, prophylactic move, because white's planning to play on the king side. So he's got a nice solid center. He's supported it very solidly. So now it's time to do something about it. He goes g4. The plan is after knight h4 to play takes, takes, and f4, followed by f5 and generate a kingside attack. You could question this plan. I think black objectively is doing okay here. You could question this plan and suggest something else. Maybe a3 and b4 is possible. Other things you could do, you could play rook c1 and stuff, but this is a very incisive plan, and you know, generally speaking, I trust the judgment of 2,700 plus players on this sort of matter. So sure, black hasn't managed to break down white's center yet, and since the position's closed, white is going for a wing attack. Knight b4. White doesn't want to give up either of his bishops, so he goes bishop b1. And now, here's where you can really call black's decision into question. He played f6, which is really just a little too weakening, it turns out. Maybe black should play, perhaps even, I guess bishop b5 is possible. Because yeah, if it takes on b4, I want to take on e2 and then take back on b4. Maybe this is a better move, I'm not totally sure. But anyway, I'm pretty sure f6 isn't right, because it kicks the knight back and then plays queen d3. And the problem is that white, well, okay, he gains a tempo on h7 makes black weaken his position a little more, and then the queen slides over to h3. And yeah, this is the problem, because yeah, now the bishop's a bit screwed over on h4. So yeah, this is why I think bishop b5 is a better move, because it just stops this idea of queen d3 altogether. I've put bishop b5 in there twice now. Let's get rid of one of them. Anyway, this is a problem. And yeah, black ends up having to give up the bishop and hope for counterplay. But e5, it's always important to look at what squares your opponent's last move left behind. e5 is trying to generate activity, but it does leave the d5 square behind. So white switches his bishop over to a2, opposite black's king, and attacking the d-pawn. Black went bishop e6, but f5 was a problem. The payoff of f4 so many moves ago. And yeah, the problem is after, for example, takes. Yeah, this is an issue, because if you play, for example, bishop takes f5, bishop d5 comes in. Remember, white is still up a piece for like a couple pawns. And if you play bishop here, then yeah, you won't survive this. Rook g1 check, and it's going to be mate. So Orlov, he tried queen takes b2, but this just wasn't enough. F takes e6, whoops, queen d2, bishop d5 comes in, and yeah, now e7 check is coming up. So black tried to block it, but this didn't end up being enough. White infiltrated, and black resigned. So yeah, just quickly going through that game again, this is a nice illustration of the potential of white's position. So bishop on c3 looks kind of passive, but it very nicely holds together b2. It acts as a tall pawn, which is obviously not an ideal role for a bishop. But in this case, you know, you could argue that black's bishop isn't much better. The center's closed, so, you know, the value of bishops isn't all that high anyways. So white ends up using the closed center to start a wing attack, which is at very least a good practical decision, because it puts black under a lot of pressure. But this is just one of the possible plans. Again, expanding on the queen side with b4 can't be bad. Just putting a rook on the c file, playing natural moves, like maybe rook c1, queen d2. Probably you do want to play a3 at some point just to keep pieces out of b4, but you could do something. You could double on the c file, for example. Ponomarev's plan was very ambitious, and it turned out very well for him. And I think here f6 is where black went wrong, and he should play a move that stops white's plan of attacking. This is, again, very common, dropping the bishop back, creating a battery towards h7, and black's position quickly fell apart. Because the one thing g4 did, as well as try to expand on the king side, is it makes black misplace his knight. It's not well placed on h6, and by misplaced his knight, I mean after takes, now the bishop is misplaced. So you have the choice between either you take a turn to return it, which wastes a tempo, and the price of a move becomes much higher once white is ramming his f-pawn to f5. So you don't necessarily have time for that, but you also have to worry about ideas like g5. Maybe this chops the bishop. And again, you've got these queen d3, queen h3 ideas coming up. So that's going to conclude this illustrative games section. I hope you've enjoyed these games. I hope your understanding of the French and the Tarrasch variation specifically has improved. And yeah.